Welcome to Tejal Khandelwal Study Center. Today's topic is theories of the state. So let's revise theories of the state together. What is the concept of state? State is an institution having authority. It is a political association which exercises sovereign jurisdiction within defined territorial borders. As per the Montevideo Convention, the criteria for defining a state is a defined territory, a population, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. It is one of the central concepts of political science, yet it invites the highest amount of scholarly debate. Thus, the concept of state is very difficult to define. It remains one of the most contested concepts. The next question that naturally arises to our mind is what is the concept of government and how it differs from the state. The government is the agency or the machinery of the state. The government is having various institutions, it has various rules in order to do the administration of the authority it possesses. The state is an abstract concept. On the other hand, the government is its concrete form, which means when we talk about the state, we can talk of it in terms of having a territory, having a population, having a government. But where do we locate the state's power? That is in the working of the government. So government is concrete, government is machinery, and state remains more of an abstract idea in that sense. The state is a permanent and continuing institution. For example, after the independence of India, we know that the Indian state had been established and we had the source of its power within the constitution. However, despite whatever challenges that have come to the Indian state, has the Indian state been abolished? No. So state remained permanent. It remained continuing. What came to be dissolved is the government. What came to be changed is the governments. So governments change, governments are dissolved, but states remain permanent. Now, states have enjoyed a lot of loyalty on the part of its citizen. On the other hand, we can say that some governments are good, some governments are bad. Some governments are efficient, some governments are inefficient. But always the admiration is enjoyed by state as an entity. It is a symbol of national greatness. Now, let's understand one more concept which might create some confusion, and that is the concept of nation. What is nation? Nation refers to a population which shares something. What does it share? It shares a sense of collective identity. And this sense of collective identity is based on various attributes. It can be culture, it can be language, it can be some great historical past or historical continuity that has been going on from the ancient until the modern times. So the nation represents people who have something in common and they feel that sense of collective identity. So it is a cultural concept. So there can be the idea of a collective sense of identity even without the presence of a territory, a state that way. So for example, the Palestinians had shared sense of being a nation, but they didn't they were not recognized as a state prior. Okay, so even the Quds people, they can have a shared sense of collective identity, but still the state of creation of Kurdistan has not been formed and legally recognized. So in that way, state is a political association, and in the Montevideo Convention, it lays down criteria to be recognition. On the other hand, nation is a cultural concept. What is the concept of nation state? So when we look at the concept of nation state in its literal terms, it implies a cultural concept being merged with a political concept, which means on the basis of being or sharing that collective sense of identity, we are formulating the political borders, which means the political association in the form of state. That is its literal meaning. However, if we look at the concept of nation state, it emerged in the West, it emerged in Europe, and we should not look at it in its literal terms, because perfect nation states don't exist. And what is the idea of a perfect nation state? Which means the idea of one nation, one state. There is not one nation that exists anywhere. There is no sense of that kind of homogeneity, and there is always heterogeneity and diversities that exist. And despite these diversities, when you still feel that share of, when you still feel that being or sense of collective identity, you become a nation state. So it was something that emerged after the Treaty of Westphalia, and nation state came to become an intellectual construct in order to reorganize people and ensure that this nation state becomes an entity which has its own defined territory also, it has its own government also, it has its people who have a common sense of collective identity, and all nation states who are recognized as such will treat each other as equals and not interfere in each other's matter, which was actually leading to a lot of wars in the history. So after the Treaty of Westphalia, there was recognition of nation state and all will be termed as equals. Okay, now whether India is a nation state, it is said that India is a civilizational state, which means we have a shared collective cultural past, and that continues as a symbol of a nation until today. But we should not be compared with the Western nation states as looking at them as an ideal type. So, in the broader sense, the concept of nation state is an intellectual construct with a powerful political force. Okay? So there can be nations and they may not be having states. There can be states which may not be having nations, which means there might be so many differences, wars, internal conflicts, that still people don't feel that collective sense of identity. But in the Indian context, it is unique. We still have a common historical past that connects us. Maybe Hindi is not the national language, but it still binds people. We have it as an official language, and we also have the existence of many other languages in the country. So maybe the Germany, which is constructed on a German language, it is not the same in the Indian case. But still we have the idea of Indianness that binds us. So we should not be compared with the Western construct of nation state as looking at them as an ideal type. Okay? Now, however, the concept of nation state in the international sphere has become a primary unit, so that all states will be considered having some common sense of identity as well as a political authority association, and everybody will be looked at as equals and no one interferes in the matters of others in that sense. Okay? Now, Let's look at the concept of sovereignty. Sovereignty means supreme power. Now, this supreme power for what? This supreme power for making decision making, for exercising decision making. Now, whether this supreme power is in the law, whether this supreme power is in the ruler, whether this supreme power is in the state, has differed in different times. That's why the concept of sovereignty has evolved. So maybe as Aristotle says, sovereignty's location is in the deliberative organ of the state. The Romans within the centrality of the administration, right? Bodin in the law, the king. Bodin in the king and Austin in the law. But Hobbes makes it in the state. So state is supreme. State equating sovereignty or supreme power within the state. State, which is political authority, is done by Hobbes. And who does it in law is Austin. Austin puts it in the legal, the law, which is the supreme and the sovereign. And Hobbes does it in the state. So state being sovereign and supreme is a modern construct because Hobbes is a modern political thinker. Machiavelli also spoke of sovereignty, but he could not locate it very correctly. Aristotle also have spoken. The Romans have also spoken. But the concept of equating sovereignty with the state, integrating that feature as a key attribute of the state is in the modern construct, and that credit goes to Hobbes. Okay? Now, then it emerged in Locke, which means the consent of the people. Then Rousseau, who talks of people's will, general will, sovereignty. Then in Hegel, which is again state is march of God on earth. So the concept of sovereignty, someone associating it with the king, someone with law, and someone with the state, has changed over the period of time. Okay? Now, when we talk of sovereignty, it has two dimensions. One is the internal sovereignty and one is the external sovereignty. Having internal sovereignty is very important. Only then you can exercise it efficiently externally. Which means if you cannot control your house and you can't put it in order, how can you tell the world that let me decide what I want to do? Because your house is not in order. So internal sovereignty is very important attribute, which means the government of the day, right? The agency of the state should be able to control, maintain, regulate all the affairs. For example, when India talks of Article 370, the reorganization of state, and any person, any state, anybody comments that this is not fair, this is not legitimate. So India clearly instructs them this is an internal matter. Why we say internal matter? We say which means we have a government who is elected by the people and who has the supreme power to decide what has to be done with 370. And nobody else should instruct us on that matter. So it is an internal matter. We are enough powerful to decide what to do within our internal matters. Okay, so it is in this context we should see. When we look at external sovereignty, which means we have the independence and autonomy in our foreign policy on how we conduct ourselves with other states. So the capacity, for example, the capacity to enter into relations with other state, which state can do? Only the one who has internal sovereignty. Okay? So how we have relations, we want to maintain relations with USA, whom we want to give weapons, whom we don't want to give weapons, whom we want to recognize as a state, whom we don't want to. is completely our own matter, which means we have an elected government who is sovereign in that sense to decide on such affairs. And nobody else should instruct us on such matter. And when we say external sovereignty, which means all of us are equal, whether it is a Fiji or whether it is a country as big as India, everybody is externally equal and sovereign on whatever matters they want to do within the frame of the United Nations or at the international level. Okay? Now, let's move towards the theories of sovereignty. The first is the monistic sovereignty, which means supreme power in one organ, or in law, or in king, or in state, which means only one source where all the power is concentrated. That is monistic aspect of sovereignty. Okay, which means at one time, no two associations will compete for who is supreme. No individuals, no association, and no institution. Okay, so state sovereignty, state is supreme. That is the modern construct, where state is the only association who demands and commands all the respect, all the authority, and whatever the state makes, the laws, everything will be at the command of the state. So, monistic theory, Hobbes in Social Contract makes Leviathan the absolute sovereign. So, that is the political aspect of sovereignty he creates. Now, John Austin put it in the sphere of law, legal view of sovereignty, which means it is the sovereign is absolute, unlimited, inalienable, and indivisible, which means there is no division of power. Located it within the legislative bodies. So the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, parliament as the ultimate who can make a man a woman. Okay. Right? So that idea is, which means it can do everything except making a man a woman. The doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty in UK emerges from this Austinian view of making legislative bodies as supreme. Now, so what is the idea of the monistic theory of sovereignty? It says it is necessary and determinate. Authority is unlimited and absolute, which means nobody should question. Sovereign receives habitual obedience from the people, and law is the will and command of the sovereign. So law will work as per the sovereign. The power of sovereignty is exclusive and indivisible. It cannot be divided. It is not located elsewhere. It has original source. Okay. Now, however, it is more a legalistic view rather than a political view, and there is gap in theory and practice. Okay. It is more like a legal fiction. That's why it has come into question. What is the pluralistic theory of sovereignty? It says, which means supreme power is not in one institution. However, the pluralist theorists are little divided. They want to keep the state, but they want to keep the state as one of the associations like many other associations, which means there is a human being. That human being is multidimensional, which means that human being has multiple needs. So I need the family for my personal needs, biological needs. I need the church or the temple or the religion for my other needs. I need the college for my education. I need the state for any other kind of, lawmaking or judicial aspect. So I need multiple associations for my different interests. And we cannot say that it is only one which is supreme. So in every sphere, there is different associations who exercise supreme power. So maybe with religious aspects, it can be the religious association. In the family aspect, it can be somewhere else. So pluralists want the state, but they want the state to be one of those associations like many other associations. They are not talking like the anarchists to dissolve the state. They say, yes, state is an important arbitrator amongst the various negotiation and conflicting powers. But we can't vest all sovereign power within the state. In different spheres, there is different organs for sovereignty. That is the essence of the pluralist theorists. So we have somebody like Lasky and McIver, who are the key proponents of this theory. Now, so there are multiple centers of authority according to the pluralistic theory. Monistic theory undermined the importance of other associations and considered state as the central focus. So the pluralist theory advocates that human beings have human needs and multiple associations are there to fulfill these human needs. State is also one association who fulfills some needs, and there are other associations which perform different functions. Sovereign cannot be determinate, which means its source cannot be located in one. Okay, so for example, when we talk of uniform civil code today, can we think that the state is supreme and only how the state will determine the law will take shape? No, we have to have the consent of various religious bodies also in order to determine. Maybe the final construct of the uniform civil code will be done by the state, the legislature, but the consensus will have to be derived within the sphere of the society with various associations, with various individuals who head these associations. So, sovereign is not determinate in such kind of a matter. Okay. In modern times, political system, popular sovereignty, which means it rests with the people. People will decide what is to be done. So why did the Prime Minister have to withdraw the laws and reforms in agriculture? Because it was people who didn't want. Why we had to exit out of RCEP? Because there was opposition from people. So in times where people have rights in democracy and other things, right, it is not the state which becomes the supreme in that way. That's what the pluralists are saying. So they reject the notion of law as spoken of by Austin. Austin puts all supreme power in legislative bodies, legal sphere, and Hobbes did it in the political sphere. Okay, so they reject the notion of law as pointed by Austin. Okay, what do they say? That laws are universal, which means the Prime Minister will have to also go through the same courts, same process if he does something which is unconstitutional. So laws are universal and they are made for both the lawmakers as well as the citizens. Okay? Everybody has to respect customs and tradition. They distinguish between state and society. Society has different association and state also exists within this sphere of society. Okay? Absolute sovereignty, as pointed by Austin, they say, is criticized by the pluralist. It is incompatible with the interest of humanity. Why? Because humanity's interests are multidimensional. Against international peace and tranquility. If we give the state ultimate power, then other needs will not be fulfilled. Okay, and this kind of states will always only for their interest. The leaders, the elites for their interest will keep on fighting wars like we see in the case of Russia and Ukraine, Israel, Palestine. Okay, the leader of the Hamas. So how this continuous things are happening? Now, so Lasky is an internationalist. He talks that since society is federal authority, so democracy and decentralization are very important concepts in the pluralist. And Lasky says, since there is decentralization in society, which means there are multiple needs, there are different associations, even authority should also in different spheres be federal. Okay. However, he says, state is keystone of social architecture, which means most important element which will bind all of them together, which will negotiate the conflictive interest and make into one harmonious whole. State is not an end in itself, it is a means to an end. enrichment of human lives, for the enrichment. So they don't make state as an end, but a means to an end. That's why keystone of social architecture. GDH Cole also gives the concept of functional sovereignty, which means different institutions have power in their area of specialization. Okay. So this has led to rise of federalism. That's why we have the different list, which means agriculture has to be a state subject because it is at the different local patterns how agriculture will be practiced. State government is better utilized. The legislature is different. The executive is different. The judiciary has different specialization. So in that sphere, they should be supreme. Okay. That's what is the concept, which means how different organs have different areas and specialization. You should give them power in that regard. Okay. Now, MacIver says state is both child as well as parent of law, and he gives the concept of service state. What does MacIver mean when he is also a pluralist? What does he mean when he says state is both child as well as parent of law? Which means state is the creator as well as state is the one who ensures that law is being followed. Okay, so state is that. And he says service state, which means if the state serves, then it commands. It commands only because it serves. The time it stops serving, it will not command obedience and authority. There is no other reason that state can command except that it serves the people. It fulfills the needs of the people. It does certain duties on behalf, which maybe citizens cannot do on a daily basis. Okay. Now let's move towards the perspectives on state. So we've understood sovereignty, we have understood nation, we've understood nation state, we've understood difference between state and government. Basic concepts associated with the state. Now let's move towards the perspectives. Now let's examine the liberal perspective on the state. The liberal perspective on the state emerges from the individualism that is central focus of liberalism as a philosophy. So the liberal individualist tradition is the basis, which talks about liberty of an individual, rule of law, natural rights, free market economy, property rights. So when we talk of the origin of the state in the liberal terms, there are two theories. One is the social contract tradition, as we see in the works of Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau. Hobbes gives the social contract on the basis of the anarchy in the state of nature. Locke on the basis of inconveniences in the state of nature. And Rousseau says it is the will of the people which ensures qualitatively that they come into a contract. And eventually it will be sovereignty of the people. On the other hand, when we look at the functions of the state, the classical liberals talk about the minimal state, which means negative liberty, and state does not interfere in, or state does not have any obligations in that regard. It should only be a minimal state, which means a police state in that regard, state being considered as a necessary evil. On the other hand, as per the functions, the modern liberals spoke about the welfare state, which means state have positive obligations and ensures that it removes all the challenges and constraints that individual face in realization of positive liberty. So welfare state enshrines a lot of functions on the state to fulfill. On the other hand, the minimal state has no functions apart from ensuring it doesn't interfere and leaves it to the free market economy. When we talk about the nature of state, in this sense, there is consensus that state is seen as a neutral institution, which means state does not belong to any particular class. State is neutral in this sense, which means state is an equilibrium maker in society. It fulfills and functions on behalf of all classes, and it negotiates so that the best, because here the focus is not class, community, society. The focus is the individual. So there is state appears neutral to the liberal perspective. Now, let's look at the Marxian theory of state. The Marxian theory of state can be viewed in two ways. One is the instrumentalist perspective on the state, and the other is the relative autonomy or the structuralist perspective on the state. Now, when we look at the origin of the state in the Marxian terms, firstly, they say that state and society are distinct entities. Why? Because it is the society which consists of two things. One is the base, which is the economic structure, and one is the superstructure according to Marx's base and superstructure model. And the state is merely a reflection in the society, which is obviously a broader entity in that way, of the relations in the economic sphere, a complete reflection only of that kind of relations of production. So Karl Marx points that the origin of the state is not product of any will or social contract. It is a rule of strong over weak because it is merely a reflection and perpetuates that kind of exploitation. And it is a product rather of force, right, in order to exercise that supremacy of the ruling class. Nature of the state for them is not neutral. It is not acting as an equilibrium maker. It is continuing the same exploitation that happens in the base. So superstructure is also merely a reflection of that. So it is an instrument of the dominant class. That is the nature. And what is the function of the state? Function of the state is to bring in exercise functions on the behalf of the bourgeoisie. So the state is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. It fulfills all the functions that the bourgeoisie needs to perpetuate their rule. By ruling the base, it will also rule the same thing in the superstructure, which means there is no relative autonomy in this perspective that Marx had given. So there is a stronger instrumentalist tilt that we see in the Marxian perspective. Now, when we talk about the structuralist or the relative autonomy basis of Marxian theory, we can look at it in the works of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Though this theory of relative autonomy in this sense that Marx is saying is not a very consistent view, but the relative autonomy can be, the traces and the origin can be located in Bonapartism. Okay. Now, first let's just examine the instrumentalist perspective in this regard of what Marx had only said. So Marx in the Communist Manifesto says that state is instrument of property class. It is based on the base and superstructure model. So the state has materialist origins, which means what is the origin? The base. And what is it? The economic structure. So state is reflection, which means it has materialist origins. State as a product of class society. It is a class institution, which means it is not neutral. It is exercising and working on the behalf of the bourgeoisie. Then in Lenin also in the State and Revolution continues this instrumentalist perspective on state like Marx, and he sees state is an instrument for the oppression of the exploited class. Okay, so that continued. Now when we talk about the structuralist school, the importance to superstructures rather has been given by Gramsci and other relative autonomist theorists like Althusser and Pulanza. However, some have tried to locate this origin in Marx's work. And yes, we know that there is no consistency, or this is not the dominant perspective according to Marx. The dominant perspective that we see in all Marx's work and consistency is obviously the instrumentalist view. However, the structuralists locate the origins of relative autonomy also. Now, the functions according to the structural school are determined by structure of society, then people who occupy positions of state power. Institutions work in the long-term interest of capitalism rather than short-term interest of the capitalist class. So there is, when we talk the concept of relative autonomy, what is the concept of relative autonomy? What is this autonomy? So this is a degree of freedom and independence where there was a direct link that Marx had made between the base and superstructure. The relative autonomy says that state has also gained certain freedom to work in the way it wants, and it necessarily does not work as the bourgeois class wants. But however, they also point that this autonomy is relative and not complete, which means at the end or in the final synthesis, we say, there is always that the ruling class will exercise or work on the behalf of the bourgeoisie only. So it is not complete autonomy, but there is only a degree of autonomy. Okay, the state has to pretend that it is not working in the interest of the bourgeoisie. Otherwise, it will not be able to gain legitimacy, and there will be a lot of protest by the people because the state is acting on behalf of one class. So to create that perspective, the state shows that it is working in the interest of all classes. However, long-term interest of capitalism, which is the structure of society, is what the structuralist school point. Okay, so they say the degree of independence or relative autonomy. Institutions have degree of independence from specific elites in ruling or capitalist class, and this is Marx's work. Also, we can locate in the 18th way. What is Bonapartism? We also see this view in Gramsci, Althusser and Pulanza because they are the one who give importance of structures which Marx never emphasized. He never emphasized on superstructure because he merely saw it as a reflection. Okay. Now, what is Bonapartism? Bonapartism means executive power is very strong in a state, which means executive is one of the organs of the state. There are other wings also. And that executive, for example, the Prime Minister's office becomes very centralized. Okay. So when it will be very difficult for the bourgeoisie to dominate or dictate the terms on this strong executive. And in such a case, the executive will work not only in the interest of this bourgeoisie, but it will work in a way which will be like a relative autonomy. Okay. So Bonapartism says state executive is strong and legislature is weak. Societies where multiple mode of production exist, over there different classes will emerge. So in the industrial mode of production, there is only the bourgeois class, the capitalist. But if there are multiple modes of production, every class will dominate differently in different sphere. So it is not one propertied class, okay, and not one dominant class. So there is no single class which is able to control economic structure completely. Therefore, state gains relative autonomy and state itself becomes very powerful. So the bourgeoisie doesn't have enough power that it can dictate the terms on the state. Okay, it is in this context that we can locate relative autonomy in Marx's perspective also. But this view is not very consistent. Now, Gramsci developed structuralism. He is also known as theoretician of superstructure. So he also talks of opaque state where civil society is strong, and transparent state also he has spoken where civil society is not very strong. So over there, it is easy to bring revolution, but in opaque state it is very hard, okay, because the civil society is acting like a buffer. It is creating hegemony and the intellectuals exercise this function. Now, let's move to what is Louis Althusser's perspective on the state. He belongs to the structuralist school. He is a French scholar and he gives the importance of structures. However, he gives multi-structural analysis. Now, when we look at Louis Althusser, we need to understand that he has spoken of the state apparatus. What is the state apparatus consist of? The state apparatus, according to him, has two aspects. One is ideological and the other is the repressive. When we say ideological, which means the civil society, the family, the church, the school, the university, the communications, the media, through which the state promotes its ruling class ideology, and repressive state apparatus, which means the police, the military, the bureaucracy. So, what is it that state uses according to Louis Althusser? So, he says that the ideological state apparatus is primarily functioning in order to create that kind of hegemony. However, when it is not sufficient to create that kind of hegemony, then the state also uses the repressive state apparatus. So effectively, both are important component, ideological also, repressive also. But primarily ideological state apparatus doesn't work on violence, and primarily the repressive state apparatus works on violence. That is the key difference here that he is trying to make. Okay, now, so firstly, when we talk of Louis Althusser, we say he talks on the importance of ideology. So he says it is the structure affecting individual acts, and which is the one which internalizes the worldview, how we look at the world. That is the importance that he is giving to ideology. All right. So he says it makes an individual a subject, which means the individual will internalize a way of thinking, and that is what the state wants. It wants to make that citizen or individual a subject, and by that ideology, every aspect of life, individual, state, community, law, religion, the individual will look at everything only from that ideological prism. Okay, now, so Althusser, therefore, it is impossible to escape ideology. Then he says there is a distinction between individual and the subject. That's what we understood. Ideology changes individual to a subject, and subject is not an autonomous being. He is guided. He is already blinded by the ideological prism. And what is this prism? This prism is the prism of capitalism, which is so structurally embedded in society that an individual cannot come out of this thinking. Okay, now, so he talks of social formation. Actually, social formation can be equated with society. Okay, so Marxists rather use social formation than society many times. And what is this society or social formation consisting of? It is consisting of, it is like a complex of, we know, always economic, political and ideological aspects. Okay, all operate together, says Althusser. The economic base determines in the last instance. So yes, it is also important, but always the ideological superstructure dominates. Okay. Now, political and ideological level is always over determine things. Now, therefore, relative autonomy to superstructure, who is giving? Althusser. So he talks of two apparatus, ideological and repressive. In this, he says the religious, the educational, the family, the legal and political. Now, political and legal are part of both. They are part of ideological as well as repressive state apparatus according to Althusser. These two structures. Then the trade union, then the cultural ideological state apparatus. So economy, polity, education, religion, in all sphere, state is creating ideology as a key instrument. Okay. Now, the repressive state apparatus is army, police. Okay. So he says there is a plurality of ideological state apparatus. Ideology of ruling class binds them together. State power is held by ruling class by both ISA and RSA at the disposal. तो जब ideology से काम नहीं बनता है, कोशिश तो होती है उसी से रूल की जाए, बट अब जब वो वर्क नहीं करेगा, then they will use what? The repressive state apparatus. Okay, so we have to remember which terms when we talk of Althusser. Firstly, he gives a multi-structure analysis. He gives importance to structure, just like Gramsci also gives importance to structure, which Marx had ignored. Then he talks of social formation. He talks of role of ideology. He distinguishes between individuals and subjects. He talks of how both are at the disposal of the state, the ISA as well as the RSA. So it is the superstructure, okay, which is actually determining thing and not only economic always. Now, a very important debate in the welfare state, which is the post-capitalist society. Okay, so capitalist society is modern, and then there is the advanced capitalist society, right, which has come in the advanced capitalist society and post-capitalist society are more in the context of the welfare state. Now here also, how is the nature of state has been debated by Ralph Miliband and Pulanza. So they are the key thinkers. Ralph Miliband continues the instrumentalist perspective of Marx. And Pulanza says, no, it is the structural analysis that we should analyze, and we should talk of relative autonomy in this regard. Okay? Now, let's see what is Miliband saying. So, Miliband gives the instrumentalist view. He says, state in capitalist society in his work 1969. He says capitalist society is common economic and social features everywhere. Wherever you go, they will have certain common features. What are these features? Okay, so they are like a democratic state, right? And it limits the autonomy of the electoral governments, that is the elected government. Now, different government institutions and actors are deeply embedded in a capitalist market. We cannot separate it. How much ever this democratic state wants, okay, they are absolutely entrenched within this capitalist market. The political equality, he says, is a myth. It is always, we see the reflection of economic power in the superstructure. That's what he's trying to say, right? Economic wealth remains concentrated. And he also says managerial revolution is a myth. I will come to managerial revolution in the next slide and again relate Miliband so you understand better. First, let's understand what Miliband says. He says there cannot be any parliamentary road to socialism because this democratic state cannot be expunged out of the capitalist market, how much ever we want. Okay. Now, bourgeois democratic state will remain inherently unreformable. How much ever welfare state are saying no, there are changes, parliament has come, there are competitive political parties, they are catering to different classes, different interests, no. Eventually, market is the one who is determined. He gives facts also. He has used a more empirical method. He has spoken of things with more factual analysis, which will be obviously criticized by Pulanza. Okay, so he gives an example that from 1899 to 1949, if we see, Miliband says 60% of cabinet members were businessmen, which means we see how the one who dominates economic class also controls political power. So always state is a reflection of the base in that sense, right? So those controlling economic power are controlling political power. All right, so Miliband gives instrumentalist perspective of the welfare state. Fine. Now, let's see why he says that managerial revolution is a myth. Why political equality is a myth. Okay, let's move. So, who gave the concept of managerial revolution? So, James Burnham also speaks of managerial revolution, And there are other thinkers also who speak on managerial revolution. Okay, when we talk of the account that James Burnham is giving, he's actually giving a very pessimistic account of managerial revolution, which means he is saying very determinately that there will be a managerial elite that will come, and how they will be the one who will become very strong. And it will not only be the capitalist class as we saw in the earlier times. So this managerial class will also become very, very what? Strong. And they will be the one now who will determine things. Okay, let's see how Burnham talks. So he says there is decline of the older forms of capitalism, obviously. That's why only managerial elite will come. Fine. So rise of what? He associates this with rise of joint stock companies. Now, very importantly, he points that there is separation of ownership and control in industry. Ownership class is different and the one who controls is different. Okay. So Burnham says that salaried managers, they manage, they are given very hefty salaries, they are very talented, they are very skilled, they are technically very sound. Okay. And on the basis of probably merit that they might be coming to gain such hefty amount of salaries and packages. Okay. And then there are the shareholders who own it, who own companies, which means how the whole idea of stocks, shares, this has come. They are the owners. And the salaried managers are the one who manage and exercise control. He says there will be emergence of a managerial elite, which means the skilled and technically qualified. The state, when the state will, like he says, when the state will nationalize industrial enterprise, the power of these managerial elites within these state companies will enhance. Okay. So yes, he is giving that managerial elite will rise everywhere. Now, if we look at later theorists, they talk of this managerial revolution in a more optimistic sense. Burnham was very determined, but he was again giving it in a more pessimistic account. And the later theorists give a more optimistic account. They say, no, the managerial revolution is good. You know why? Because these managers are in fact going to look at social welfare. They will be the one who will be concerned of the, subordinates, the people who are working in the company. And for them, the goal of profit is not the aim, like it is for the owners. They are working with more other kind of motive and intention. So the later managerial revolution theorists talk of it on a positive note. So they say that managers are benevolent and socially responsible. Welfare of workforce has greater priority and not only profit. So Burnham is giving that yes, managerial elite will rise, joint stock companies will come. Later says no, these managers are good. But what will Marxists say? So Miliband says it is a myth. Why he talks of it like a myth? Because he wants to say that profit will never go in from even the mind of these managers, because they will also become shareholders. The company will give them some part of the stock also to give them their sense of responsibility and ownership. So Marxists will criticize managerial revolution in this sense. Now, so separation of ownership and control is illusory. Okay. Top managers are shareholders also in the companies. They make vital decisions of the investments, mergers, and motivation for them also is maximization. So when Ralph Miliband says that managerial revolution is a myth, which means even today we can't separate ownership from control. it remains an illusion. And the idea that yes, managers are technical, sound, skilled, they can come from elite class is also one of the ways, but that is not the core of what Burnham wants to talk. Okay. So yes, obviously, he says qualities are that they are skilled, technically qualified, which means they can come from any class. But his major argument is the differentiation that he's making from ownership and control. And now it will not only be the capitalists, it will also be managers, he says, who will become elite. Okay. Now, Pulanza gives a structuralist perspective of relative autonomy. So he says, rather than saying capitalist society, we should look at it like a capitalist state. So he says, why relative autonomy? He says, it is functionally necessary to prevent capitalist collective failure. Capitalist state best serves in the interest of the capitalist class only when no direct participation in state apparatus. Otherwise, it will become obvious. When it becomes obvious, protest will arise. Okay. So, internal divisions are also there among the bourgeoisie. So, multiple bourgeoisie emerge. Why? That monopoly capitalism is not there in the same way. Okay. Now, state must have freedom to make concessions to the subject class to diffuse the radical working class protest. So, it will pretend that way. Now, normal times it is easy to maintain neutrality by the state, but even Pulanza will say that in crisis time they come to the rescue of the bourgeoisie. So, state emerges as an equilibrium maker. It comes closer to the liberal perspective that way. Okay. Now, let's move towards the post-colonial perspective on the state. Now let's examine state from the post-colonial perspective. The key concern is that they challenge the Eurocentric perspective of looking at the world. And there are independent ways of looking at the state. What are the post-colonial societies? Which means which have had a colonial past. So in that case, even America has had a colonial past. Does it still classify as a post-colonial society? No. Because it has broken the tradition from its colonial past. Only those states that have still the legacy and continuity of features, right, is known as the post-colonial states. Now, we can look at, there are various names and perspectives that are given, but they are referred to as strong or weak state on the basis of the capacity of the state in order to manage. And this is obviously economic infrastructure also, as well as how the relationship between the civil society and the state, the bureaucracy is taking shape, which means when we say that it is a weak state, which means its capacity to implement things, not only because of economic infrastructure, but also how the other interest groups and associations will become very strong, which the state will not be effectively able to manage. And when we say a strong state, which means it will, the relationship between the political class, the political groups, and the bureaucracy is very strong in that sense, how they are cohesively managing things. Okay. So when we talk of weak and strong states, these are the terms that are associated with post-colonial states. They are also called as competition states because they are in the garb of attracting investments from the developed world. All right. Now, when we look at the post-colonial perspective on the state, there are two ways of looking at it. One is from the liberal viewpoint and the other is from the Marxist viewpoint. So, let's see how. When we talk about the liberal perspective on the post-colonial state, we can say that in the comparative approach, there are political modernization, political development, political cultural approaches that are used in order to analyze states in the different parts of the world. Now, F.W. Riggs' work and contribution in this regard is very important. He calls the post-colonial states as prismatic societies. Now, what is a prism? So, we know what is a prism. On one side, there is a fusion, and it's fuse. The prism is in the transition, and then there is diffraction. So, there is very strong features that are there in the fuse. There is diffraction in the other, but prism is something which is in transition. So when we say prismatic society, which means they are the societies in transition. Societies in transition imply, which means there will be continuity of the traditions that are part of the customs and norms of that society on which it is built. And we'll also see some features of modernity that have evolved because of the colonial past. So when F.W. Riggs analyzes the prismatic societies, he says that these transitional societies are not fully industrialized, but more industrialized than the agrarian economies. He says fused are the prehistoric stage where we see, multi-functions that are given to social structures. Diffracted, which means the developed ones, okay, which means functionally very, very specific ideas. And prismatic, which means the developing, which is the intermediate stage. So we have to understand this fused, which is prehistoric, the diffracted, which is the developed, and the prism, which means the transition. Okay. Now, so he says that there are certain features, okay, of these prismatic societies. And when we say they are societies in transition, which means there will be always coexistence of tradition and modernity. Fine. Now, the first is formalism. What is formalism in this sense? Formalism means realism, which means to what extent we see what is spoken of in terms of norms, rules, and how they are actually in practice. So, when we talk of norm and the reality, the degree of congruence that is there in prismatic society, right, will be very, very low. That is the idea of formalism, which means there will be a strong gap between theory and practice. Now, what this shows, why there is gap in theory and practice, how it will actually emulate, which means the rules and laws, when they come in terms of implementation, there will always be some modalities which these bureaucrats will be able to exploit, and they will enjoy a high amount of discretion with respect to its interpretation in application. So when they say formalism, which means there is a high amount of discretion that these officials have, and obviously this will lead to high corruption. That is the first feature of these prismatic societies. The second idea is heterogeneity. What do you mean by heterogeneity? Which means there is a simultaneous existence or presence of different kind of systems here, practices, viewpoints. So presence of futures, which means we can say there is an urban intellectual class which will be coexisting with a rural traditional class. So we see lot of heterogeneity, lot of diversity in that sense. There is coexistence of all kind of viewpoints, rules, people, okay, within these societies. Why? Because there is an uneven social change that exists within these prismatic societies. And that is why we see that because of this uneven social change, there's a lot of heterogeneity. Okay, now then we see the other idea is polynormativism. What do you mean by polynormativism? Which means there are multiple norms, which means traditional behavior patterns coexist with new set of norms, which means there is a lot of lack of consensus on the norms of behavior that we see within these prismatic societies. Then comes polycommunalism, which means lot of communities, and they may be even hostile to each other. There may be tribal groups, there may be religious communities, there may be caste groups, there may be ethnic communities which are very hostile to each other. And this whole idea of, that one sense of nation may probably not be so maturely developed like it is within the other European or the fused or the diffracted societies that Riggs talks of. Okay? So yes, simultaneous existence of ethnic, religious and racial groups. So what is the impact of this on the state? Is that the loyalty of the officials will be more towards their own communities than the government and the machinery, than the idea of loyalty towards the state. Okay, so that is the other feature, polycommunalism. So we see how every feature has a different implication when we see the coordination, the working of the officials in this regard. He says that there are two different models, one in the economic and one in the administrative aspect. So when we talk of the economic model, one is the bazaar and one is the canteen. What is bazaar? Bazaar is a place where everything works, prices are determined on the basis of demand and supply, which means competition should be the rule in a bazaar. What kind of good is required, what is the demand, that will be the supply, and accordingly prices of good will be demanded. Second is canteen model. What is canteen? Canteen is something where there are fixed prices. If I go to eat, if somebody higher to me in class variation goes or somebody lower to me, anybody goes there, it will be like a fixed price. So there is a cap. So there is coexistence of both bazaar on certain sectors of economy and certain sectors will be canteen, which means rationalized prices in the sense of food distribution systems we see. It works on like the canteen model. So that will be more in the agrarian setup. So there is subsidized canteen as well as there is what in this sense demand supply also that operates. Now what about the administrative model that Riggs is talking? So he talks of an administrative system. He says Sala, which means there is modern bureaucracy also, and then there are traditional courts also that will exist. There is also nepotism that we will see with respect to the officials. So there is influence of in fact family, their cultural norms that will impact the administrative system rather than them working on the basis of some legal rational rules. Okay, so this is how the economic model, everything is in a phase of transition within these society. It is an uneven social change that is occurring. Now, if you see presently, India is trying to overcome its colonial past. So we see the naming of many cities, many places, right, which had colonial names to names which are more indigenous. So India is trying to overcome its colonial heritage in this sense, the colonial past in this sense. Okay. Now, another perspective that has been given with respect to the liberal view on the post-colonial state is by Gunnar Myrdal. And he coins the term the soft state. What is a soft state? A soft state is a state which is not having the capacity to manage the various interest groups, the various infrastructural deficiencies, and there is a key governance deficit that we see within this state. Okay? So he says soft state is the one which is having social indiscipline. Why there is social indiscipline? Because people have the legacy of not obeying the authority of the state. Like the revolutionaries, like the freedom strugglers never obeyed the authority of the state. So that same social indiscipline, civil disobedience kind of tendency, Mridal is saying, is continuing even in these post-colonial states. Okay. Now, so they have a poor capacity to enforce law and order. Reasons: because of legacy of the national movement, colonial legacy, as well as culture and tradition in India that has been going on. So they say that how India has not been very strong with, challenges like Naxalism, insurgency, militancy. So India is a very soft state in that way. Okay. There are perspectives which say that, but rather we have used force where it is required. It is just that the government wanted a hearts and minds strategy on how they wanted to approach the Naxalites. Now let's move towards the Marxist perspective on the post-colonial state. It can be divided into two. One is the instrumentalist perspective and the other is the structuralist perspective. So when we talk of the instrumentalist perspective, we see it in the works of A.G. Frank, Emanuel Wallerstein, and they talk of the dependency, okay? The idea of development and underdevelopment and how these, specifically the states in Latin America, in Africa, and certain states even in Asia, how there is an unequal terms of exchange, how their economies are dependent on certain export products, and if there is any disruption within these key export products, then their economy may get unstabilized also. So the fairer terms of exchange that should work as per market and demand and supply in a market, that don't exist when we see the relationship that exists. So dependency school talk of development, underdevelopment, which means relation, how they have developed with the developed state. What is the terms of exchange? Okay. So Samir Amin, Emanuel Wallerstein, A.G. Frank are the key, and they say talk of core and periphery and unequal exchange. And we will study this instrumentalist perspective again when we will do paper 2 in more detail. Okay. Now, let's move towards the structuralist perspective, which is given by Hamza Alawi. And Hamza Alawi talks of the overdeveloped state, which means he says there is a sort of a relative autonomy because there is not one single class which is so dominant that it will dominate even in the superstructure. There is indigenous bourgeoisie, there is landed class, there is a metropolitan bourgeoisie also that has developed. So when there are so many competing bourgeoisie classes, then one cannot totally determine how the state will be governed. And he talks of overdeveloped state, which means compared to other aspects, the political and the military and the bureaucracy nexus is very, very strong, which means the machinery of the state, the police, the military, the army, they are very, very strong and they exercise that kind of discipline. For example, how military has become very powerful today in Bangladesh and Pakistan. We can see they are overdeveloped states. That is not the case in India. Okay. So yes, Pakistan and Bangladesh are key examples, right, that we can say. So there is a mismatch between the economic. So economic development, they failed, right? Pakistan has failed, maybe not Bangladesh to that extent. On the other hand, political development, which means the bureaucratic elements, the military elements, these machinery of state have become very, very over-powerful, okay? Colonial master have introduced the modern state and there is a very strong executive. So when we say overdeveloped state, so imagine like Bonapartism. Okay. Now let's move towards the feminist theory of state. I have discussed this in feminism also. So there is no feminist theory of state as such. There is only feminist perspective, which is the key idea for feminism. Core theme is patriarchy. However, many feminist thinkers have given different interpretations. So they say, Catherine McKinnon says, when I look at the state, it appears male to me, which means I see that the norm of patriarchy dominates how the state functions, how power is being exercised. Okay, which means through the laws. So Susan Moller-Okin says how through various laws, state pervades the sphere of the family and controls the women. So even state is a patriarchal structure. Okay. Now, it is an institutionalized form of male power according to McKinnon. Then we have Carol Patman. She says that the social contract, it was assumed. Even Rawls says heads of the families. So it is not a social contract between equally competing individuals. It is between what? It is taking the form of a sexual contract, and women's consent is taken for granted. Iris Marion Young says liberalism has a problem. It has universal citizenship and doesn't see that women need to be treated differently. They need to be given some benefits. There has to be, you can't be gender blind. So Iris Marion Young says there has to be differentiated citizenship that needs to come into picture. Okay. So Okin also says how state interferes in the sphere of the family. That is the feminist perspective on the state. Now let's look at the anarchist. Why this perspective is important? Because they look at state in a very radical sense. They are not the ones who like the state. Okay. So we see they criticize and they do a radical condemnation of the state power. They are the anarchists. So Mikhail Bakunin says it is a negation of humanity. Murray Rothbard says there is no legitimate claim to exercise the authority over the individual. Okay. So anarchists have a severe condemnation towards the state. I hope all these perspectives are clear and you should use these keywords, okay, that I have highlighted in this video in your answers. Thank you so much. All the best.